I'm going to be talking about something a little different. I'm going to be talking about non-human primates' responses to death, specifically conspecifics' responses, their responses to conspecifics' deaths. And this is a bit of a new area for me. I work with non-human primates. I've worked with them in social groups for years, so I've witnessed this. But it's a very new area of research for a variety of reasons that I'll get into. And so it's a little light on the data. So I have the pleasure of getting to talk to you more about the ideas and what we're starting to think, and I will present the data that there is that's out there. So we know that non-human primates die. We see a lot of responses to these incidents. And one of the things that's a real problem when you're studying something like this with non-human primates is anthropomorphism. So I'm going to start my talk with a little segue into what anthropomorphism is. So it's defined in a number of different ways. If you look it up, dictionary.com says it's the attributing of human characteristics and purposes to inanimate objects, animals, plants, and other natural phenomena. Wikipedia says it's the attribution of human traits, emotions, and intentions to non-human entities, considered to be an innate tendency of human psychology. Merriam-Webster says it's an interpretation of what is not human or personal in terms of what is human or personal characteristics. So we all know what it is. The question is, why is it a problem in science? And particularly, why will it be a problem when we're talking about death? And the reason why it's a problem in science is it's generally considered to be the application of human phenomena to animals. So for instance, you see your two dogs, they're getting along very well, you think they love each other. I think my dog loves me. We probably all think our dogs love us. We hope they do. But we don't really know. We're ascribing our assumptions about our intentions to what another organism is doing without really having an understanding of what's going on. And a lot of times this leads to a confusion between outcome and mechanism. So this is a really important point when we're talking about evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, where we're really looking at two different things. One is the outcome or the function, what organisms are doing, what are we usually measuring? And one is the mechanism, so how is that happening? So the mechanism can be anything from an underlying cognitive mechanism, like are they solving that problem by matching, or are they solving that problem by showing a bias towards one solution or another? Or it can be an underlying hormonal mechanism or whatnot. But you can get in many different areas a similar functional outcome by a very different underlying mechanism. And this becomes a particular problem when you're talking about these sort of, I'm going to anthropomorphize here, higher order human-like phenomenon, like how you respond to death, because we have assumptions about how we respond. We know how we respond. So very naturally, we're going to ascribe those emotions to other organisms. So for instance, when I was growing up, my grandma had a dog who was her hearing ear dog. It was a service animal. She was very, very close to this dog. When my grandma died, the dog acted depressed. So naturally, we assumed that the dog was going through the same series of emotions that we were. I actually do think the dog was going through a series of negative emotions, but we didn't really have any way to test that. And I was 12 at the time, and my 12-year-old self was convinced that this dog was just heartbroken. So it's very easy for us to do because it's really the only way we have in many contexts to interpret what's going on. I do want to throw out one sort of positive on the, for using anthropomorphism. There are a couple of benefits. First of all, anthropomorphism may be useful in that it can help us to see larger patterns in these behaviors and provide insights that we can then test empirically, and to develop these hypotheses for the underlying mechanisms that again can be empirically tested. And that's the critical point. It can be useful if we're using it to make hypotheses about what's going on and then go back and test them. So for instance, going back to my grandma's dog, if I had wanted to do a study, I could have then said, I think that dogs that lose an owner, particularly when it's a very tight relationship like with a service animal, that they're going to suffer a series of setbacks that are related to depression. We could have, if I had not been 12, we could have measured hormones, we could have maybe looked at brain imagery, we could have looked at behavior, and we could have begun to test the hypothesis. So it would have given us a place to start. So that's more or less what's going on with how we're looking at the primate death literature. It actually goes back some time. The earliest references I could find, there appear to be some references in some of the older literature. There was a paper published in the 1800s about grieving in a chimpanzee. There was a pair of chimpanzees at a zoo, a male and a female. They were apparently extremely close. The female died, and the male went into what the author referred to as grief in a way that was wildly anthropomorphic. I've got a copy of it if anybody wants to read it afterwards. But it was interesting because it was in an age where people really weren't ascribing those sorts of emotions to animals, and yet this was put in as a note in this journal because it caught the attention of this scientist. So, of course, when we see images like this, where you've got a mother chimpanzee with a dead baby, and for the record, if you don't see these images are pulled from people's papers. If you don't see that, it's one of my pictures. And when you see a picture like this of a mother with a dead baby, it pulls at the heartstrings, particularly for those of us who work with these animals, because many of us who work with these primates have worked with the same animal for 20, 30 years. And so we have emotions when they die, and I think sometimes it's hard for us to then separate them out. So what I'm going to do to sort of give you a background, and because there isn't a whole lot on this, is sort of run through what we have in a phylogenetic way. I'm going to start with the prosimians. If you don't know much about primates, they're divided generally into 4 different groups. They're the prosimians. These are the ones that are the most distantly related to humans. They were their lineage separated from the lineage that led to the rest of the primates, including us, the longest to go. They're the ones that are restricted to Madagascar. And they are the least like us in many respects. So they have claws instead of nails. They're more focused on scent instead of vision, like we are. A lot of people don't actually think they're monkeys. They really are. But I'm going to start with them, and then we'll go through the New World monkeys, which are the ones that are in South and Central America. They were named by Europeans. And then they are the next most distantly related from us, followed by the Old World monkeys and then the great apes. And then following that, I'll provide some of the hypotheses that people have begun to discuss, which I think are relevant for understanding us as well. So there's very little work on prosimians. This is a red-ruffed lemur and its baby. So there is no real evidence of maternal nurturing of dead babies in prosimians, but one of the big reasons may be that unlike all of the other primate species, among the prosimians, the babies are solely responsible for holding on to their mothers. So after they're born, they cling on to their mother, either sometimes a little bit ventrally, which means on their stomach, the rest of the time dorsally, and the mother doesn't do anything with that. And so once the baby has died, there is no way for the mother to hold on to the baby and maintain contact with it. There is one note that I found where they mentioned that a baby took a while to die. It had fallen, it was injured, and it took several days actually to die. And the mother kept going back and forth between her baby and the group. And so she would try to carry the baby briefly, but she wasn't able to maintain it. And so the authors put forth that maybe this was the lone example that they'd seen of this sort of tension between wanting to keep up with the baby but not being able to. But certainly the mother wasn't able to cling on to the baby. This baby could cling on briefly, but then kept falling off. The other thing is that apparently among these prosimians, they're completely arboreal in most cases, which means they spend most of their time in the trees. And falls are an incredibly common form of death. They don't hold on properly, off they come. And apparently the mothers routinely assess very, very rapidly and move on. So unlike a situation where maybe an infant is sick and it dies, it may be that they're having to make a much more rapid assessment about what's going on. New World monkeys. There's surprisingly little evidence on New World monkeys. I work a lot with New World monkeys. This is a picture, actually, of a capuchin monkey named Mango, who died just in February. She was 55 years old, which, if you know anything about capuchin monkeys, is insanely old for a capuchin. They live 35 to 40 years in the wild. They live a little longer than that in captivity, but not 55 years. So we suspect she may be the oldest one on record. And it's interesting, we saw evidence that the capuchins were restrained after she died, but we didn't really see anything in particular. We realized that she was getting sick. I mean, we've thought she was going to die for 20 years, to be honest. She was 55. But we recognized that she had gotten ill at the end, and so we were able to collect fecal samples for cortisol analysis for a good chunk of her group in the week and a half leading up to her death and then afterwards. And I was hoping to have them analyzed for this talk because it was was a lovely coincidence, and they aren't in yet. But we didn't see any changes in behavior. We do observations on our groups 2 to 3 times a week, so we look for changes in behavior. And except for the fact that the grooming no longer includes Mango, we didn't see any big changes. One of the things I should mention, though, is Mango is 55 and arthritic and slow, so she wasn't a central member of the social group. So it's not necessarily surprising that her absence wouldn't have changed any of the social behaviors. She wasn't a key member of any of the grooming. She was the mother of the alpha male. And she certainly got some attention. We did notice, again, anecdotally, so we're definitely veering into the grounds of I'd known her for 20 years when she died, but we did notice that her son, who in our observations spent relatively little time around her. In the last week or so, she was spending most of her time in one particular spot that was her favorite spot in the enclosure, and her son kept coming over and spending time with her. He'd groom her or just come lie down next to her. So it's possible that they recognized what was going on, and if that's the case, we might see a spike in cortisol, and we'd be able to determine something. But we didn't see anything obvious. The group didn't change their behavior. There was no big difference. We also did not allow that. They didn't have access to the body afterwards, so I don't know what they did with that. Squirrel monkeys, there is evidence. There's one paper from the 70s where a squirrel monkey in captivity lost its baby. The baby died, and the mom carried the baby around for a couple of weeks. There's a very odd study from the 70s where somebody froze babies that died naturally, they didn't kill the babies, and then gave the mothers access to them on a weekly basis to see how long they'd interact with them. And it turned out that mothers who'd had a stillborn had no interest whatsoever in in interacting with the corpses. Mothers who'd had an infant who died at about a day or so of age were interested in interacting with the corpses of all babies, and that went on for about 6 weeks. They didn't discriminate between theirs and others, and mothers whose infants had been older than a couple of weeks were only interested in interacting with their baby, and that too went on for about 6 weeks. So it seems like they needed to have some time to interact with their kid before they were specifically focused on their infant. And that's really all there is for New World monkeys. Old World monkeys, there's more evidence, mostly from macaques and golden monkeys and snub-nosed monkeys in China. So there's lots of evidence for care of dead infants. There's also some more evidence for care of dying adults, like I was talking about with Mango. So there's a nice study on care for dying infants in Yunnan snub-nosed monkeys. There's several subspecies of snub-nosed monkeys, and this has been documented in a number of them. You can see here's a female, she's carrying her baby, she's grooming her baby, and then the far side, she's also grooming her in a different spot. One of the hypotheses of the authors for why we would see more grooming in snub-nosed monkeys than in see more carrying of infants in snub-nosed monkeys than in other species is because these guys are in northern China where it's quite chilly. So it takes quite a bit longer for the corpses to decay. And in fact, as I'll talk about later when I talk about some of the hypotheses underlying these, one possibility is that you see more dead infant carrying in species where the environment is such that you don't see the corpses just rot instantly. So in particularly arid environments and in particularly cold environments. It also could be, of course, differential research effort. Almost all of the papers I'm talking about were published in the last 10 years. So there just isn't that much yet. Especially for primate research, the last 10 years doesn't mean very much because it takes us a while to get all of our papers out and get the data. There's a really, really nice study by Sugiyama and colleagues on care for dying infants that's based on a long-term study in Japanese macaques. They actually followed this for years and recorded all of the infant carrying episodes in this particular group. So there's some nice data on it. I think they had 150 or something like that instances of infant carrying, or instances of infants who died. So they found that of the infants that were carried, about a quarter of them were stillborn, and about 3/4 of them had lived fewer than 30 days. So you don't see much carrying in infants that lived longer than 30 days. If you look at it another way, basically the majority of infants who are carried have lived between 1 and 30 days. You don't see a whole lot of carrying in infants that are stillborn. That's what 0 indicates over here. And you see very little carrying in infants that live longer than 30 days. So there seems to be a sort of critical period here in whether or not mothers carry the infants. For the younger end, one of the hypotheses is that if this has to do with female bonding or with bonding between the mother and offspring, they simply haven't had a chance yet to bond with the offspring, and so therefore they're not as interested in carrying it. However, that is contradicted by another hypothesis, which is that this has to do with hormones, and that the mothers have sky-high levels of maternal hormones after these babies are born, and these hormones don't go down to 0 instantly, and so they're continuing to care for these offspring because they've got these high levels of hormones, and that you see them ceasing care after the hormone levels drop down to normal. The tailing off after about 30 days, there isn't a good explanation for why that might be. It could be that the babies are getting larger, although even at 30 days they aren't particularly large, so that doesn't necessarily make much sense, but it could tie into the hormones as well. On average, these Japanese macaques are carrying their babies their corpses for 3 1/3 days. So it's a pretty long time to carry around a dead infant. The sort of modal number seems to be about a day, but you've got moms who are carrying them up to about 3 weeks. So a fairly long period of time. As you'll see in some of the what I'll talk about with the chimps, at that point, these corpses do not look like babies anymore. Most of them are either mummified, they're missing limbs, they're missing jaws, things like that. So it's kind of hard to believe that the mother still thinks it's an infant at that point. But they continue to carry them, and interestingly, you don't see revulsion like you might expect from other members of the group. There's some documented cases, particularly in the macaques, where other members of the group will avoid the corpse, but not so much in the chimpanzees, where actually there seems to be attraction to the corpse, despite what the researchers describe as quite a smell, and the fact that the mothers are busy waving flies away. In golden snub-nosed monkeys, golden monkeys, excuse me, there's also evidence for care for a dying adult. There are a couple of documented episodes. I liked this one the best because it's a really well-documented incident. These guys live in what are called one-male units, so there's a larger band, and within these bands there are essentially harem groups where there's a single male, multiple adult females, and their offspring. So like Hamadryas baboons, if you're familiar with those. And in this case, a female became ill. She was sick over the course of about a week, and she ultimately died. And these are just pictures across the sort of time span of the whole situation. The male in her one-male unit spent an enormous amount of time with her leading up to her death, and was also spent quite a lot of time with the corpse after the death. And so did some of the other females in the group. None of the other members of any of the other one-male units ever paid any attention to the corpse. And in fact, what's been documented in a few of these other cases is the same sort of thing. When you get these interactions, it's often in these very tight-knit social groups. It's all the other ones that have been documented that I found, at least in Old World monkeys, are in one-male unit social systems. And it's almost always other members of the one-male unit that are spending time with the corpse or with the dying individual, and other members of the social group, of the larger troop who are not member of the one-male unit are either actively avoiding or are just ignoring. So again, it seems to be based on the relationship quality. Moving on to great apes, virtually all of the research is in chimpanzees, which is probably just because most research effort in general is in chimpanzees. There is one study in gorillas that shows that gorilla moms are carrying their babies, at least in the Virunga Mountain gorillas, which actually ties in nicely to the theory of the fact that this only really happens in situations where the corpses don't immediately decompose because it's quite chilly in the Virunga Mountains. Most of the evidence, again, is for care of dead infants who are often carried until they're mummified. We also see some evidence of care for dying adults. Just in case you're interested, that is what a baby that's been carried for multiple weeks looks like. It is difficult to believe that the mother thinks that that's a real kid at that point. So one of the interesting things about this is the mothers interact differently with these corpses than they do with the babies. Now, obviously, they're going to have to some degree. Even with chimpanzees and monkeys, where a lot of what you're seeing is where the mothers do, in fact, help carry the infants, they're still clinging on some. So I said earlier that you don't see any of the carrying in prosimians, likely because the prosimian moms have to do all of the, because the prosimian moms don't do any of the carrying because the babies do all of the clinging. In the simians and the great apes, you do see moms helping out some, the infants also cling some, but in this case, obviously, the mother's having to do all the carrying. But there are documented reports of things like moms holding the baby, kind of around the neck like this and walking with it. So, they're sort of stepping on it as they go, which no mother would ever do with an offspring. Or when they go to get a drink, completely submerging the baby underwater while they drink and then picking it up and moving on and continuing to care for that corpse for days afterwards. So their behavior indicates that it's more than just, oh, of course I'm having to change my behavior because I'm now wholly responsible for carrying it, but maybe that they recognize that it's not necessary to keep this one's head above water anymore. It's hard to tell. They continue to groom. They continue to do things like pick at the teeth. They continue to carry it. You do also see other members of the chimpanzee group who show great interest in the baby. So initially, it's usually just the mother who's carrying the baby. But it has been documented that all ages and sex classes, so that means both males and females, ranging from juveniles to adults, are carrying these corpses or be showing interest in these corpses. So it's not just the mothers. And that's not completely limited to the great apes, but based on my qualitative reading of the literature, it appears that among the great apes, there's more interest from other members who are not the mother than you see in the old world monkeys. One of the interesting patterns that was nicely documented in a paper by Katie Cronin, and this is at a group that's in a sanctuary, sort of semi-free living. This is supposed to be one long time frame, and if you look at the y-axis, this is simply proximity to the baby. So the higher, does this have a, oh, awesome. You can almost see it. So the higher these little the higher these bars go, the further the mom is from the baby. So here the mom's further from the baby than here. And what this basically shows is that over time, the mom gets further and further from the baby. And that's what you see whether the mom is carrying the baby for a couple of days or in some cases has been documented for up to about 2 months. Over time, the mom gets further from the baby, puts the baby down and walks further away, stays away for longer periods of time, and also becomes more likely to let other individuals pick up the baby and carry the baby away. There are responses to death in older individuals. This was also from Katie Cronin's group and Edwin Van Leeuwen's group in this particular sanctuary. A 9-year-old male died. And the other members of the group were very, very interested, so they left the body in for several hours. And other members were clustered around. They were coming up and grooming. The far picture over there is a picture of them actually cleaning the male's teeth with grass stems, which is interesting because you do see tool use in chimpanzees, so it appeared that they were using a tool to work on this. Around most of these documented cases, you do see forms of aggression, so you see the males doing displays, beating on the body. It's not clear why. It's not clear whether they're afraid or whether they're trying to, I'm going to yell at you and scream at you and see if you'll wake up or what. There's not enough evidence to really draw any conclusions. So you do see some aggression. You also see great interest. You also see lots of sort of care behaviors. So again, you could interpret these in many, many different ways, and that's one of the problems we have is obviously it is unethical to go in and start killing off monkeys or apes and see what happens, and so we're relying on when this happens naturally, and there happens to be someone there who can watch what's going on, and because we can't do experimental studies, we're limited to observation, so we can't really know causation. And so hopefully one day we'll have enough data to actually be able to answer some of these questions. There isn't much data on adult chimpanzees dying. One of the best studies is from Jim Anderson's group. It was on an older adult female named Pansy at a sanctuary or a zoo park in England. It was a group of 5 chimpanzees, and the female was quite a bit older. She was in her mid-50s, which is old for a chimpanzee. And she died after an illness. And they documented not only that the chimpanzees the other chimps in her group showed a lot of interest in her as she was dying, but interestingly, they documented some changes in those chimpanzees' behavior after she died. So her daughter, who was in the group, slept with her that night, and then sort of sat watch in the area where she died. They had conveniently just finished a study looking at sleep patterns in these chimpanzees, and they were able to document that their sleep was very interrupted and they didn't sleep for nearly as long or in as long of bouts in the couple of nights after Pansy died than she had in the study that had been completed about 6 months prior. And they also, Pansy had died on the sleeping platform that everybody slept on. And for about 5 days afterwards, nobody slept on that sleeping platform. And then the first one back on there was her daughter. So again, anecdotal, but it does look like there were changes in the other individual's behavior after she died. And she was a pretty central member of the group because she was one of the older ones. So to sort of summarize some of these ideas, most of these post-death interactions are involving babies, and it's generally mother-offspring. So you do see some interaction between other individuals and the dead baby, particularly in chimpanzees, but it usually starts with mother-offspring, which is probably not surprising. A, the mother's going to be the one who's with the offspring when it dies, and B, she's the one who has the closest bond. This hasn't been studied that I could find in any of the paramodid species with biparental care in primates, but you would assume that there might be some differences there where you'd see the males showing equal amounts of care. Interactions with adults have rarely been reported, which it's not clear whether that's differential research effort, differential opportunity to study, or just they don't care as much when males die. But when it is reported, it's interestingly always in these situations where you have these close relationships. So within the one male unit in these old world monkeys, or in this case like Pansy, where it's a central member of a very small group that's been together for a very long period of time. The interactions typically only last a few hours, but they can last days or weeks. I think the longest documented one I saw was about 2.5 months where they carried around a baby. And as you saw for the Japanese macaques over the course of that multi-year study, the average time to carry the corpse was over 3 days. So that's a pretty long time. And depending on the species and the group, these interactions range from very, very rare, which again either haven't been documented or people have been looking and seen it happen once or twice, to very, very common. So there's a group of chimpanzees in the wild that are in a particularly arid environment where in a study that was done over, I think it was a 5-year period, half the mothers were carrying their babies when they died for up to a couple of days. So the authors of that study actually made an argument that it could even be a cultural behavior in that group. That's just kind of what you do when your baby dies. And they also noted that it was a particularly arid environment. So again, you get more chance of mummification. There are a number of open questions. So why do others stay with the corpse, or mothers stay with the corpse, since it's usually the mothers? There are a number of options in the literature, and I'm just going to run through them and sort of give you my thoughts. One is confusion, that they don't understand that it's really a dead body. I don't actually buy that one. For the first couple of minutes or with a new mother, sure. But a lot of the ones who've been documented doing the most carrying are multiparous mothers who've had multiple offspring, and many of those offspring have survived to adulthood. I find it hard to believe that they don't know that there's something different about this baby. So for a first-time mother, especially if the kid falls and it's the first few minutes after this has happened, I suspect that's actually very likely that the mother just doesn't understand. But for some of these who've had 6 or 8 offspring and they've carried 3 of them after they've died, but the other ones have made it to adulthood, I don't think that's a great explanation. One is curiosity, and I should say none of these explanations are mutually exclusive, and in fact I would say that there's no way there's just one. There's got to be interacting things. I think curiosity is a great explanation, particularly when it comes to chimpanzees and the non-mothers who are showing interest in the offspring. It's different, I mean, if you talk to little kids, this is anecdotal, but little kids become very interested in death around a certain age. It's something that's confusing and it's not obvious and it doesn't happen very often, and I suspect that maybe some of these animals are doing the same thing. This is odd because it still looks like, your brother or your friend, but it isn't the same. One, which is related to confusion, is that they simply aren't aware of death, and so that they don't understand that this could happen, again, for the same reasons. I think that it's very possible that they aren't aware of death, but I don't think that that explains this behavior. One possibility, which I'm going to do with hormones, is that this is some extension of the attachment bond. So especially with the mothers, they still have very high levels of maternal hormones. They're bonded to these infants. This is really supported by the fact that you see this more in that sort of critical period after birth. I think that's very likely. I don't think it's the only explanation, though, because first of all, not all mothers are carrying their infants, and secondly, there have been, now that people are interested in this, there have been a number of females who've been documented carrying infants past when they went into estrus and started mating again. So maybe that's why they started carrying them in the first place. And it's probably, I would bet it's playing a role, but it's not the only explanation. This isn't just a hormonal byproduct. One very reasonable hypothesis, I think, is that they're learning about death. So there's this hypothesis about parenting with primates that a lot of the alloparenting you see is that they're learning about parenting. So you see lots and lots and lots of young females who want to carry other females' infants, and they're not very good at it, but they are learning how to do things, learning how to carry, learning how to feed, learning how to drag them back. They may be learning about death. The only way to learn is to interact with these dead bodies and learn that, yeah, this one is really not coming back. This is not just a sleeping conspecific. This one is gone. Whatever they understand is gone. And I think that largely explains the interest of others in the corpse as well. Another possibility is mourning. This one is the one where you have to get really careful, be really careful, because we are crossing so close into the grounds of anthropomorphism. It's so easy for us to interpret it that way. However, the fact that the majority of what we're seeing is happening in relationships with very tight bonds indicates that there is at minimum a change in behavior related to losing someone who's part of your tight-knit social group. And there's no reason to think that there couldn't be something more going on. We do know that they have so close social partners. We know their behavior changes when they lose those. We know infants' behavior changes when they lose their mothers. There's no reason to think that there couldn't be some of this going on as well. There's also the question of when do they abandon the corpse. Part of it could be hormonal cues, as I said, related to how long they've been bonded to the baby. Again, they seem to have to have been bonded with the baby for some period of time. Interestingly, one of the original hypotheses was that they would abandon the corpse when the visual and olfactory cues dissipated, but that doesn't seem to be the case, given that they'll carry these babies long past when they look like babies and when they're stinky and have flies around them. They are more common in slow decomposition environments, so I suspect that if it doesn't explain why they do it, at least it explains a lot of the distribution. You're not going to have it happen in a situation where these kids are starting to decompose within hours. And it's also possible that they don't understand that they're dead, and that once they've carried it for 3 or 4 days and understand that, yeah, this one's really not coming back, that then they're more likely to be willing to abandon the baby. Why is there so little evidence for care of adult deaths? This isn't really addressed in the literature, but I got curious about it when I was reading it. One possibility is there may be fewer adult deaths recorded. Lots and lots of primates die when they're infants. If you can make it past your first year, you're doing great, between falling and all sorts of other horrible things that can happen to you. And also, a lot of the adults may not die in situations where we can see them. You know, a male who gets ousted from his alpha position and wanders off into the forest and dies isn't going to have anyone else around him, including humans, to observe it. It's also possible that there's more attention paid to the infants, both by the other primates, but also by the researchers. So researchers may notice more when there's a baby around. And it also may be that there's a closer bond between the mothers and the infants and the increased togetherness, which leads them to pay more attention. And I think that's actually supported by the fact that where we do see evidence of care after an adult dies, again, it's in these close social relationships. Possibly a better question is, why would we even expect to see the same response in the primates that we see in humans? Because after all, we are primates, but we are not the same as them. After all, animals certainly have relationships, they certainly have emotions, they have very close relationships, but it's not clear that they can understand inevitability, and it's not clear that we could even test to see if they did. I mean, any experiment that we tried to run in the lab, what we would really be teaching them is that human experimenters can do what we want. So I'm not sure that this is a question we can actually test. So they may not understand it in the same way that we do. Their relationships are also not the same as ours. So they have very close relationships, but we don't know that they really have them at the same degree and level as ours are. We assume that they do, but we don't know that they do. And that might change the way they respond to death as well. And perhaps a bigger point is, even if they do have reactions to death, and even if they have reactions that are distinctive from how they would react to another sort of loss, If they're different from ours, it's hard for us to identify them. Just like there's no way for us to know what it is like to be a bat from a philosophical perspective, it would be very difficult for us necessarily to recognize a response that wasn't similar to what we have. Of course, there's the value of anthropomorphism in forming these hypotheses, but it also makes it very challenging for us to see things that are different because it's difficult to step outside of ourselves and look at this. There's also the question of how much of the human reaction is based on a social context or a social construct that you wouldn't expect to see in the other primates. And then a bigger question is whether or not they have the underlying cognitive factors to understand death. And I think we have some answers to that question. So if we assume that they could understand death, what factors would they need? So a sort of speculative, non-exhaustive list. They would need the emotional capacity to mourn. I think they have that. They may not have it to the same degree as us. People since Charles Darwin have been talking about emotions in animals. Charles Darwin anthropomorphized here a bit, so we don't necessarily need to rely on that, but we certainly know that non-human species of many types, not just primates, have emotions. They have tight social bonds. We know that they respond negatively when those social bonds are disrupted. There's no reason to assume that they would respond any differently to death. It's been argued that they would need empathy or pro-social concern. I'm not as certain that I buy that one about death, actually. But if they do, there have been some arguments that at least some of the great apes have empathy and pro-social concerns. They seem to recognize what others need, and they seem to be willing to do things to help others, particularly, again, within these social relationships. Whether you need to have empathy to mourn when someone dies, however, I'm not actually sure you do. You can miss someone without necessarily caring what happened to them, I think. So I'm not as set that this one needs to be there. There also may need to be some self-awareness or theory of mind. So in order to understand this sort of inevitability and the fact that someone is gone, you may need to recognize that they are no longer aware that you can't interact with them anymore. We do see some evidence in primates for self-awareness and some basic aspects of theory of mind. It is not as well developed as in humans, obviously, and it differs quite a bit across the phylogenetic tree. Great apes have better perspective-taking skills than other species do. None of them have full-blown theory of mind, but they certainly seem to recognize that other individuals can interact with the world differently than they do. Jim Anderson has argued that you would need cultural variation in behavior across groups because he argues that part of interacting with death is a social phenomenon and that you have to have a sort of cultural way of doing this. That, I think, is one where we can solidly say that, yes, primates have this. This is an example of stone handling in Japanese macaques. We see lots of evidence of differences in cultural behaviors across primate groups, whether they are monkeys or great apes. There's also the question of whether you would have to have some sort of awareness of the future, planning, mental time travel, et cetera, to understand that the fact that this individual is not moving now means that they won't be here tomorrow. This sort of ties into this inevitability idea. And this is one of my favorite studies of future planning, even though it's not necessarily the best one. It's from this chimpanzee in a zoo in Scandinavia, who likes to store up rocks and throw them at the spectators at the zoo. So there are some studies indicating that at least on the short term, great apes are able to plan for the future. So monkeys will show motor planning over short time scales, and great apes are planning at least a few days in advance. The problems with interpretation, of course, one of the big problems that we've got is that many of these studies are either in captive groups or are in semi-wild groups, so provisioned groups or groups in sanctuaries that are in these sort of semi-wild areas. So we don't necessarily know how this translates into actual wild groups. Some of the data are in the wild, but I think it will be really interesting to make sure that what we're seeing in captive situations are the same as what we're seeing in the wild. It may be that if you are living in a captive situation with tons and tons of food and no reason to have to worry about predators, you have the flexibility to be able to carry a kid around for a couple of months, or at least until the zookeeper takes it away. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It may tell us that they have this capacity that's unexpressed and that it is expressed when they have the opportunity to do so. But it is important, I think, to discriminate between the two, and a lot of times these aren't necessarily done. I found papers about wild studies published in zoo journals and papers about zoo studies published in journals that usually publish for the wild. So we need to focus on that a bit more, and I think it's time that we have enough studies to start really discriminating between the two. We have a lack of controlled studies paired with a lack of ability to ethically do controlled studies. So I don't think we can solve that one. But it is going to inhibit our ability to really understand causality in some of the, and understand and tease apart the underlying mechanisms. And there's not much we can do about that. I mean, it's simply unethical to do any of the sorts of things that would be required to start separating animals from either killing or separating animals. So we just aren't going to have answers to that question. And of course, we have to worry about anthropomorphism because it is, again, so easy to look at some of these videos and see how we would react when we're looking at them. And that's true whether it's, you know, your 12-year-old self or whether it's someone like me who's been studying these guys for 20 years and knows better. You still, if it's the animals you've been working with for 20 years, it's hard not to look at it and see that. So, to summarize, these guys, in non-human primates, we see lots and lots and an increasing number of situations where animals are interacting with corpses, and they're interacting with them differently than they do when those animals were alive. They're interacting with them for a long time, particularly with the infants, which is probably just because they can carry the infants for longer. They are doing so particularly in these relationships where they are have very long-term bonds or strong bonds, so infants who they've known for longer than a day, and with these tight bonds in the one male units. They're showing behavioral changes subsequent to the death of a close associate, particularly when it's adults. You wouldn't expect that with an infant. An infant hasn't had time to integrate into the social group and hasn't changed the behavior patterns of anyone. But we are seeing that some with the older individuals. And they certainly have many of the cognitive capacities we would expect to be necessary to understand death. If you want my opinion, I think they do understand death. I think that they understand that an individual has disappeared. What I don't think that they have is this sort of, I'm going to sit here and contemplate my future that we get with humans, because I don't think they have the cognitive capacity to do that or the future planning to be able to think about what that would mean. So they may make a nice species for us to study because it helps us understand some of these behavioral changes without necessarily understanding all of the things that are layered on top of it. So certainly worth studying in their own right as well. Thank you.
We have time for one question.
Great talk, I loved it. Also a big fan of primates. Maybe you don't know the answer to this, and I think it bridges a little bit on anthropomorphism, but have you noticed when chimps are carrying the infants, the type of death versus, so infanticide is common in chimpanzees, right? And there's gotta be some sort of social cue when the alpha male kills the baby for any number of reasons. Mm-hmm. Is the reaction still the same?
So none of the ones that I was looking at were based on infanticide. It would be interesting to see. With the infanticide, the mom would have mixed motives. First, you've lost that baby, but secondly, you also need to go to cozy up to that new male really, really fast. I mean, that sort of gets into the sorts of things David was just talking about, because you've got these conflicting costs and benefits going on. I didn't see a paper that was subsequent to infanticide, but that would be something that would be really interesting to look at. I don't know if it's because they aren't carrying their babies subsequent to infanticide or because nobody has written it down. Thank you.
Thank you again, Sarah Brosnan. Thank you.